Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back. I'm almost recovered from the feast. I think that's, I can't honestly say I'm completely recovered. You know how he said the time seems to go very fast, but it is incredible how much stuff can build up at home in that very fast-moving period of time. And trying to dig out from all that, has really been a struggle for us. But we're getting there, and of course the office was still open all the way through the feast, so we got quite a bit done in the office during that time. But it's good to be back. I know that from before the feast, we've all been watching with considerable anxiety what's been going on in the Middle East. It's been a very sobering time. A lot of people are dead, a lot of people hurt and injured, homes destroyed, and so forth, as a result of the ongoing, I don't know what you'd call it, I guess it's a war between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I saw a news item this week, though, that jerked me up short. I did not know this. The Israelis are taking delivery right now of their third modern submarine. It's built in Germany. Their crew has already been up training in Germany, and they have accelerated the delivery of the submarine to this past week, I believe, that they wanted the delivery of the sub. They intend to modify, they have 3 of these submarines, by the way, that they have gotten from Germany. And as they're all modern, efficient machines. They are diesel subs. But they intend to modify the subs for the delivery of tactical nuclear warheads, either on Harpoon missiles or others. The idea is if their land-based nuclear delivery systems are wiped out, they will still have a credible deterrent at sea that can't be reached by normal means. The United States refused some months ago to sell Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Israelis. They did not want to widen that conflict or take that risk. So the Israelis immediately set out to develop their own cruise missiles, which I have little doubt they will do quickly and with expedition, because they are a very intelligent people, and probably because they already have the plans for Tomahawk cruise missiles anyway that they've managed to get over the years. This is just the latest in a series of news items out of the Middle East that leave us wondering what's going to come next. The idea of nuclear deterrence makes a certain amount of sense when one is fighting a rational enemy. Over these years, you know, the idea of nuclear deterrence has kept us and the Russians from killing one another. And it has worked with us because we and the Russians both act in rational ways. But looking at this with a Western mind, there is an irrational element in the Islamic world that is utterly unpredictable. And the Israelis know this better than anyone. And so you really do wonder what the Israelis have in mind. You wonder what's going on in the Arab capitals in Damascus, in Cairo, and different places in the Middle East, and where in the world this thing is going to go next. It'll be very, very easy for this. In fact, it may already be to the point of really being out of hand and beyond anybody's capacity to get the thing under control, short of massive loss of human life and outright war. And it's a very disturbing situation. And all this naturally leads to a lot of speculation by prophecy buffs and the building of scenarios of the end time. And I bet you if you went up on the internet and started looking around, you'd find lots and lots of stuff being published about what's going to happen next in the Middle East, and naming names and places and dates and times and so forth. Let me give you Dart's first law of end-time prophetic scenarios. Dart's first law of end-time prophetic scenarios is the more detailed the scenario, the more certain it is to be wrong. Very simple. The more they try to tell you, the more likely they are to be wrong. So rather than try to give you another scenario of the time of the end, what I'm going to do today is to review what seems to be clear in the Bible regarding the things that people go to and around which they try to build their scenarios. I want to take you to it and try to make the things that are known, the things that are obvious and clear, as plain as I possibly can, so that you'll have a framework in which to fit the events that take place as they take place. Because I'm increasingly of the belief that the purpose of prophecy is not to enable us to write scenarios of what's going to happen over the next period of time with a timeline and dates and events and names and places. It's really for two reasons. One is so that we can foresee the future and repent and change so the future doesn't even come to pass. And the other one is so that we will understand as events take place, and we will see God's hand in history and not merely assume that this is just accident or happenstance or bad luck on the part of the participants. Now, the place I want to start with today is Daniel, the 12th chapter. This is a tough part of the Bible. In fact, if you start back on about chapter 10 and read your way through to the end of the book of Daniel, there are going to be a lot of places where your eyes will glaze over and you will really have very little idea of what's going on. I'm going to try, as I said, to clarify what's known about this so that you can understand. I think it's a lot easier once you understand what we know and to deal with what we don't know. In Daniel 12, verse 1, it says this. The first phrase out of the angel's mouth in talking to Daniel on this passage is, and at that time. Now, at what time? Well, at the time of the events in the preceding chapter that is just finished dealing with. I'm going to come back to them in a moment, but first of all, this is a key thing, because as you make your way through Daniel 11 and 12, you have to realize this is a seamless whole. And he keeps giving you these little references. There are pronouns that have antecedents that march back through the paragraphs ahead. And this is all appears to exist on a single timeline as you read your way through it. And he keeps making references, in fact, that lead you to think it is on a single timeline. Okay, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for the children of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Doesn't explain what he means by the book. Most people who read this assume he means the book of life, and I think that's a fair assumption. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now, this is really not too tough, is it, when you read through here? What are we talking about? Several things come out. One, we have Michael, who is no mere angel, by the way, but he's a chief prince. The Hebrew word really, prince, is probably not a good translation because of all the baggage the English word prince has with it. It's more like the captain of the Lord's host that he's talking about here. But he is not just an ordinary angel. He is an archangel or a captain of angels. He is one of three that are named in the Bible. Michael, whose name means who is like God, Gabriel, which means man of God, and Hallel, which means the shining of God or the shining one, and that's Lucifer, whom we know nowadays as Satan or the adversary. Now, there's several things in this that I think are important. One I've already mentioned, at that time. So that the events that we're reading about here are at the same time of the events that end chapter 11. Keep that thought in mind because we're going to go back to that section of chapter 11. Also, it describes a time of trouble that there has never been anything like it before in all of the history of man. Also note that this is the time of the resurrection. So there's not a lot of question that we're dealing here with. We are dealing with the end time, the great tribulation, the time that leads right up to the resurrection, the return of Christ, the resurrection of the saints. And Daniel is told in this particular passage that not only that, but he was to seal up the books and keep them. Because at the time of the end, many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And I don't know how many times I've heard people refer to this particular passage as a description of our own age, in which, boy, do people ever run to and fro as far as travel is concerned. And is knowledge ever increased and magnifying with every day? The acceleration of knowledge in the world is staggering. And so the natural presumption one would tend to come to is, we must be getting close to this time that Daniel is talking about here. Must be getting close to the time of the end. Well, now, these are sealed up. Now, down in verse 8 it says, I heard, I didn't understand, Daniel says. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed and sealed up until the time of the end. Now, whatever that means to be closed and sealed, it's an interesting question all by itself. How do you take that? Does it mean that the book itself was sealed and couldn't be read? That seems unlikely. What it seems more likely is that it's closed and sealed to understanding. that you won't understand, you won't be able to put this together until the time of the end. Now, whatever it means, though, in the first century, which was not the time of the end, Daniel was closed and sealed to understanding. So that Paul would have looked at it, the book is closed and sealed. Whatever it is to be understood ultimately, Paul would not have grasped. I would say it was still closed and sealed 100 years ago, when most of the basis of most of what you read today in terms of prophetic scenarios of Daniel were written, because a lot of what you read today by different would-be prophetic interpreters really grows out of what was done 100 or more years ago by some of the English theologians of the last century who spent a lot of time in these prophecies, comparing them to history and trying to develop an end-time scenario of what Daniel is all about, laying out what the days are and so forth. It's all been done a long time ago. So 100 years ago, the book was still closed and it was sealed, and I would say probably it's fair to say it still is. Because I don't think that we understand much more about the book of Daniel than they did 100 years ago. There may be a few archaeological things that we grasp, but I don't think very many. So we can read the words, but can we be confident that we understand them correctly? Or are they, to us, as closed and as sealed as they were to Paul? Because they had to be to Paul, remember. He said they're closed and sealed until the time of the end. Paul didn't live in the time of the end. But you, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. So, when Daniel says, at that time, he is speaking of the preceding verses, and he ties them inexorably to the last time. Now, this is important to understand this, because as we work our way back, and I'm going to do this rather differently today. Hebrew is written from right to left anyway, so I'm going to go from the end and work my way backward through this particular passage of Scripture. And you're going to see as we go back through it that it is seamless, that there is a timeline, and that the timeline is all connected, and it is end time. It poses some interesting problems as you do this, but it's important that we understand what we're dealing with. So I want to take you back now to Daniel 11:40. Just go back a little ways into the 11th chapter of Daniel. This scripture will probably be very familiar to you. In fact, it's probably one of the first scriptures that I can recall hearing my parents quote in relation to anything having to do with prophecy. I went to Sunday school as a kid. I heard all the Jesus stories and all the stuff you see in Sunday school quarterlies and so forth. But this is the oldest thing I can remember of anything I ever heard about prophecy. Daniel 11, verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now, if you think about World War II, I know it's difficult in this modern age looking back to realize how frightening World War II was to people living at the time, and people who had no idea where that thing was going to go. I remember as a child, people in my community, my parents, other people, worrying about whether or not we would win this war, worrying about the possibility that the war would be lost. I remember them citing the scripture, at the time of the end, and they were wondering, is this the time of the end? And all kinds of preachers who were familiar with the scriptures and familiar with prophecies wondered. I know that some of them wondered about the relationships between Ethiopia, for example, and the Italians at the beginning of World War I, seeing King of the South, King of the North implications in this. And people were making, back then, the fundamental mistake that a lot of people are making today. They are sitting down and writing scenarios. They are trying to read these prophecies into the events that are going on around them in the world, and I'm afraid in some cases they arrive at conclusions that are way too premature, and we don't have enough information to be arriving at those. We didn't on Ethiopia and Italy, and we don't today either. But the point is, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Now, there is a historical type of these two kings. And I would be the first one to tell you that you should study the past to understand the future. That said, the fulfillment of prophecy follows the pattern of the type, but it may be important in different in very important ways. Now, here's the thing to understand. that, many years ago I'd heard the expression, the duality of prophecy. And I was driving in a car up with some students from college up toward Fresno once. And the question, students love to discuss the Bible, the question came up, how do we know that prophecy is dual? And they talked about it for a minute, and one of the students finally concluded, well, I guess that's just something we have to take on faith. Well, no, it's not, in fact. Anyone who has studied history, anyone who has studied prophecy in connection with history, will know that these things are done again and again and again. The old statement, history repeats itself, is part of the pattern that we're talking about here. But in fact, there are two words that are often used in discussion of prophetic events. The words are type and antitype. The word type comes from the Greek word typos, which simply means a model of something else. Antitype is basically the later model of the same thing. And so that in prophetic studies, students of this understand that you will have a historic fulfillment of a prophecy. Then you will have a later fulfillment of the prophecy, which follows the same pattern, but is very different in its personalities, in its events, in the characters that are involved in it, and sometimes in the geographical locations that are involved in it. So what you do study history for is a basis for the pattern so that you can get the overall picture of what's happening in the prophecy. But you do have to understand that the latter fulfillment of any prophecy is going to be a very different matter from the former. Your job as a student is to be sure you are familiar with the issues, that you know what the Scriptures actually say, that you understand what happened in the past, so that whenever you read the prophecy, you will have a feeling for where it's starting to part company with the past. Now, this section of Daniel is interesting in an important way. It is an excellent example of the duality of prophecy, and of one of the oldest principles. That I think it's easy to understand. It may be hard for somebody listening to this on tape, but for those of you who can see it on video and or here will understand that the events of a prophecy, they line up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say through 10. And like the fingers of your hand, you can overlap them so that some of the fingers are locked together and some of the fingers are still separate from the others. It can be 2 or 3 or less or more, whatever. So that you may have in the sequence of prophecy, events 1 and 2 are purely historic. Events 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are dual, happen twice. Events 9 and 10 only happen in the end time. There's something kind of like that seems to exist in this prophecy in Daniel. There's something very much like that in the prophecies in Isaiah that start around 7 and go through chapter 10 up to chapter 11. So that you see these dualities and patterns that get fulfilled again and again. Now, what's interesting about Daniel is that the prophecy in Daniel really seems to be written not so much about the historic event as it is about the end time event, which you then make your way back to the historic event in studying it. And the reason I say this is because when you read Daniel 12, when you really get the picture of Daniel 12, there is absolutely no question about where you are. And as you begin to work your way back, you still have no question about where you are. You are still in an end time scenario. So that this king of the south and this king of the north are players on the scene at the end time. And if indeed the events that are beginning to boil up in the Middle East should culminate in some of the things that a lot of prophetic students think are going to happen, well, then the king of the north and the king of the south, whoever those individuals will turn out to be, are alive today, alive and on the scene. Where they are, who they are, that's not at all clear. And but anyway, what Daniel is describing in his prophecy is not the old model. What he is describing is the antitype, the end time fulfillment. So as we approach the time of the end, there will be 2 individuals who are the king of the south and the king of the north. That's something to watch for. Now, I would advise to resist attempting to identify these individuals ahead of time and to treat any scenario that attempts to identify them with great suspicion, because they're almost certainly going to be wrong. There's an old rule, some people talk about this about the stock market, that the stock market will do whatever it has to do to prove the largest number of investors wrong. Okay? I have a feeling that God will do whatever he has to do to prove the largest number of would-be prophets wrong. And he is quite capable of doing exactly that, and it fits with what I would expect of him. All right, back to verse 40 now, chapter 11. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. He shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now, how would Daniel have taken this? Because after all, you do kind of have to put yourself in his shoes and understand what he's being told. Well, chariots and cavalry in the ancient world were what to us today would be the armored divisions. These are the fast-moving power military. These aren't infantry. These aren't your foot soldiers with spears and bows. These are the people who are fast-moving and armored and effective, very powerful. And the implication of this is also with a lot of ships, is that this has to do with an invasion by sea, that there's a major movement into this area by sea, and I would sort of expect armored divisions based upon what he's being told here. He shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. These shall escape out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, without attempting to get involved in any latter end-time identities of people, there really would be no question in Daniel's mind as he heard him tell him this, what he was talking about. Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon were the tribes of people who settled on the other side of the Jordan River. The city of Ammon is in the modern Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today encompasses the geographical locations in times past of Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. That's where they were. So, one thing that is very clear, it actually means someone comes into Palestine from outside of Palestine, and part of his movement is amphibious. He shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He'll have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now, geographically, this is pretty easy to diagram. You just get out your atlas and look at the borders. He comes in from the north. He takes the entire glorious land. He does not cross the Jordan River, but he goes all the way into Egypt. Ethiopia he will not go into Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Libya and so forth will be at his steps. He will not have gone quite that far. But tidings out of the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, if you read your Bible very much at all, you're going to have a pretty good feeling for what he's talking about here. That someone invades Palestine, comes into this area, establishes his headquarters, as it were, in Jerusalem, in what is called the glorious holy mountain. Most people assume, who study this, that what he's talking about is planting himself right on the Sharm el-Sharif, right there where the Dome of the Rock is. And how that works out is not entirely clear. How does he get there? Why does he do it? Where does he go from there? I don't know. A lot of prophetic scenarios will speculate about this, but it does seem clear enough that somebody is coming in from outside Palestine. He is going to plant his headquarters right there in Jerusalem on the glorious Holy Mount, whatever that means. And then he's going to get tidings out of the north and out of the east that bother him. He's going to take off to conquer them, and he will come to his end at that time. So, in this context, it is the king of the north who plants his palace in Jerusalem. Then comes Daniel 12, which says, at that time. So where are we? We have somebody immediately prior to the Great Tribulation, immediately prior to the resurrection of the saints, who plants his tabernacle, and by a tabernacle or a pavilion of a king is where his headquarters is, plants his headquarters right there on the Temple Mount, possibly, in Jerusalem, just as you come up to the time of the end. And this is why, this particular passage of prophecy is one of the reasons why every time anything goes on in the Middle East, everybody starts getting excited about what's going to happen now in this time. Now, the obvious question as you come to this, you get down to this point, okay, who is the king of the north and the king of the south? How can you recognize them? What would it be that would give you the clue as to who you're talking about on this? Well, the obvious question, having answered that, is we have to go back to get a line on them a little bit further in Daniel 11. So, mind you, and again, this is all still seamless. We don't have any big breaks where we can say, okay, we've jumped 2,000 years or we've jumped to 1,500 years and now we're at a different time in history. We don't have any of that. You can study the types of this, by the way. These kings are end-time players, regardless of who their type was in history. And you can study the types in any commentary. I mean, all of them are pretty much in agreement. If you go back and read the commentaries on Daniel 11, they will give you an outline of the types of the king of the south and the king of the north. But as you read this, it's very evident in Daniel's context, he's not talking about the types. He is talking about two individuals at the end time who are the king of the north and the king of the south. Now I'll take you back to verse 27. Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Now, boy, does that conjure up visions of what's going on around us today. Again, I'm not ready to put any names on anybody here. It's very tempting to see Arafat and Barak, sitting at one table speaking lies to one another, and this, it's clear enough, isn't it, that whatever these two kings are involved in, there is a point in time where they are at the table together. Both of them have mischief in their hearts, and neither one of them are prepared to tell the truth about it. They're at one table telling lies to one another. But the end is going to be at the time appointed. Now, this is a peace conference of some sort between the king of the north and the king of the south, at which they both lie in their teeth. Verse 28. Then shall he, that's the king of the north in antecedent, return to his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. We don't know what this means precisely, but it implies that somehow out of this conference, he got a major deal and a lot of money, a lot of wealth out of the deal. Money, perhaps, maybe it's oil, who knows what it is, but whatever it is, he really liked the deal. But in this interesting thing, his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Now, you've almost got to see in this some kind of rank anti-Semitism on the part of the northern king, don't you? His heart is against the holy covenant. The holy covenant has to be, what would Daniel think that meant? Well, he'd have to be thinking in terms of the Mosaic covenant. Israel as the covenant people, the worship of God at the temple in Jerusalem as being a part of the holy covenant, the cultus, as it were, of Israel is all a part of that. So this guy has a hatred in his heart against that, which is not that hard to imagine on the part of some world leader. And at the time appointed, he will return. He'll come toward the south. It shall not be like the first time or the latter time that he's coming down here. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he'll be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Now, you read the commentaries, and they will give you all kinds of ideas from history about what this meant in the type. But remember, we haven't gotten a hint in any of this yet that we're dealing with the type. Every bit of this, in the way Daniel explains it, is in the end time, at that time, and keep working our way back, talking about the same two individuals all the way back so far in this thing. And I would presume, that being the case, that this is talking about some type of a problem when he decides he's going to make another move to the south. This time, ships from, as I think one of the commentaries refers to Kittim as the Western Isles. Daniel might have thought of Kittim as Cyprus. But the point simply being that he's going to have ships coming against him from the west at this time. He'll be grieved and return, so he's going to be forced to back off, whoever the king of the north is. He's going to make an early move at this point, be forced to back away. This is prior to his actually going into the land and planting his pavilion on the holy mountain, prior to the king of the south pushing it. Then we're going back. This is a previous encounter between these individuals. He tries something. He's turned back because of help coming from the sea. And then he has intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant, which suggests, it's really disturbing, in fact. He actually, the failure inflames him still further against the Jews, and those people that forsake the holy covenant has to mean non-religious Jews who are traitors to Israel. who are working with and cooperating with the king of the north to undermine their own people. It's not unthinkable. We've had so many examples of spies in the modern world and the power of money. It's just almost unbelievable. And, a person who has forsaken the Holy Covenant would be a non-religious Jew who has decided to go away from that and yet and is subject to subversion by an outside king. Arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. So, in the process of all the goings on, the king of the north finally succeeds militarily against Jerusalem. And what is shocking, considering the end-time context of this, and remember, there's another hint here that we're not still in the end time. This is the same king that is the king of the north against whom the king of the south pushes, all the way up to the bitter end of all this, that there is a sanctuary and a daily sacrifice going on at the time of the end. Most of the commentators, I think, tend to think in terms of this being a purely historic thing. But there's not a thing in the world to give us any indication of that. For as far as we can tell, this is seamless all the way through the same two individuals, king of the south, king of the north, as we made our way back. This king of the north stops the daily sacrifice at the sanctuary. In the historical type, this was done by one man named Antiochus Epiphanes. The temple was rifled, all the treasury was taken away, a statue of Jupiter was placed in the Holy of Holies, and boy, did that ever end, any sacrifice being done to there. And this took place historically. Now, Jesus referred to this in the Olivet prophecy. You may keep your finger in Daniel, we're coming back there, but I want to take you right now to Matthew, the 24th chapter. Jesus' disciples, after they've been showing him around the temple or pointing out things like country bumpkins, and Jesus said, I'm going to tell you the truth, boys, there's not going to be left one stone here on top of another that's not going to be thrown down. And they didn't have anything else to say until they got over on the Mount of Olives, and they said, well, now tell us, when is this going to be, and what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, the reason why this is important is because some people look at Daniel and they think, well, that's just about Antiochus Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation that was placed then. It was all history. Well, listen to what Jesus said in verse 15. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. Whoso reads, let him understand. The reason, I guess, for that last remark is, this was apparently, I think the whoso reads, let him understand was written by Matthew. Whoso reads, let him understand this. He's calling your attention to it. What Jesus is saying is that it wasn't all over with Antiochus. It wasn't all over with the abomination of desolation. That the abomination of desolation is still out there in the future coming down the pike at us. And in fact, something like it took place in 70 A.D., but is that the end? No, not whenever you go back and look at Daniel. Because Daniel is very plain that, as far as we can tell, there may be parts of it that we don't understand, I'll grant that, but as far as we can tell, the abomination of desolation is something that takes place in the context of those events leading up to in the lifetime of two kings that are going to come up and end in the resurrection of the saints and the return of Jesus Christ. It's all connected to the end time. So, you better understand this. Now, this is an important adjunct to Daniel because Jesus makes it clear that he is not talking about Antiochus. It's still future. And in fact, I don't think Daniel was talking about Antiochus either, and that's the clue. Antiochus was only the historical type. He was a pale imitation of what was going to take place at a later time. And Daniel was talking about the abomination of desolation that would take place in the generation before the return of Christ. Jesus went on to say, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him that is on the housetop not come back to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Woe to them that are with child and give suck in those days. But pray that your flight is not on the winter or on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Wow. That's the wording. The wording comes straight out of Daniel. Daniel said the same thing. And it's at the end time that there will be a time of trouble, such as never has been since the history of the world. Jesus says there's going to be at the end time a time of trouble that has never been the like of it before. Those two prophecies dovetail together, both of them with the abomination of desolation. and both of them pointing at the end time. He makes it clear that Jesus is talking about the same time Daniel was talking about. And Daniel was not talking about Antiochus. Daniel was talking about an abomination that is going to take place at the end time. And Jesus goes on to say, with this great tribulation, except those days should be shortened, there be no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So if any man says to you, Lo, here is Christ, don't believe it. For there shall arise false Christs, false prophets. They'll show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. And boy, the fingers from this go out into prophecies throughout the New Testament. You know, they keep linking back to Daniel and what Jesus said here, of how that there are going to be false Christs, false prophets, these great deceptions that are coming down the pike. And of course, one of the great ones that takes place is and it comes about, I don't know how many people is going to be deceived by it, but is the placing of the abomination of desolation. Jesus said, Behold, I have told you before. If they say to you, Behold, he is in the desert, don't go. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, that's where the eagles will be gathered together. So, Jesus is talking about what time? The end time. He's talking about the same time Daniel is talking about, the last days. Both of them are talking about the last days before the return of Christ and the resurrection of the saints. And Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then shall the tribes of the earth mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with the sound of a trumpet, and they'll gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Daniel 12. Daniel 12. Great tribulation, the return of Christ, the gathering of the saints, the resurrection of the saints, and that judgment that takes place. Now, let's go back to Daniel 11 one more time. Verse 32, where we were before. And such as do wickedly against the covenant. Now he's going, this person is a very tricky dealer. Those people who are forsaking the covenant that God made with Israel, those people who do wickedly against the covenant, he will corrupt by flatteries. He will tell them whatever it is they want to hear. You know, something we're becoming very familiar with in modern day politics, aren't we? Every time we turn around, the flatteries, the lies. People will say anything. This guy will say anything. But the people that know their God will be strong and do. He says, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many, but they will fall by the sword and by flame and by captivity and by spoil many days. So you've got a people who are corrupt and a people who remain faithful to God, and those people who remain faithful are going to go through a very hard time. When they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help, but many will cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding will fall to try them, to purge, to make them white, even to the time of the end, for it is yet for a time appointed. You know, you can't get away from it. Daniel is talking about the time of the end. Now, historically, this is seen as the time of the Maccabees. And indeed, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabees, these all are historical types of what is going to happen in the end time, but that's not what Daniel is talking about. The pattern of the end time events that Daniel describes was repeated in the generations following Daniel, and people can look back at what happened there. Verse 36, the king shall do according to his will, he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. This has echoes all the way back into the 13th chapter of Revelation. He shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. And right here is a point that I've seen several amateur, students of prophets, amateur theologians fall over or stumble over. This reveals that the king of the north is not a Muslim. He is not Islamic. Think about it. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. There isn't a religion on the face of this earth that is as rigidly monotheistic as Islam. Any allegiance to another God, any suggestion of another God, any suggestion that God is three in one, any suggestion that Jesus is God, makes you an infidel and a blasphemer and subject to having your head taken off. Understand? This man cannot command any allegiance from Islamic peoples. He is not an Islamic leader. He will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. Something else that's interesting. This description doesn't fit any Roman Catholic leader either. Just doesn't work. He actually speaks against gods, all kinds of gods, and turns himself into a god. Neither, verse 37, shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above God. You know, it's really hard to imagine, as we go down toward the end time, another God king appearing on the face of this planet. But you know, I continually find myself astonished at the stupidity of modern man. The utter, blind stupidity of what people will follow and people will believe. And so you think about the possibility of a highly charismatic leader who may even have the capacity of performing miraculous acts, of being able to pull off some incredible things in this world, and having the entire world begin to worship and to follow and to bow at his feet, who begins to claim that he is God himself. Interesting. He shall honor the God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not. Shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Now that suggests that he could come out of an existing religion, because his fathers knew a different God. But this fellow rejects them all. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. You know, these things start sounding very much like Revelation 13, the man of sin, start sounding like 2 Thessalonians 2, all of the things that we have often looked at that suggest sacrifices at the end time, a great antichrist coming on the scene, a powerful world leader, a beast and then an image of the beast and a little horn that comes up. All these little icons and images that the prophets tell us about, all of them interlace with this stuff as we're reading here in a prophecy that Daniel writes to us so many generations ago, which is end time. We're still in what has to be end time. The God of forces suggests perhaps a worship of the military, a worship of power. God only knows. I think it's important for you to know these passages of Scripture and wait and see what develops out of them. Then comes verse 40, which we've already read. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him. And that's where the big move takes place. But see, by the time the king of the south makes his move on this individual, and the king of the south could be Islamic, easily. There's no reason on your Bible why the king of the south cannot be an Islamic power. The king of the north is not. And the tension between one who is a blasphemer, an infidel in the eyes of Islam, I don't mean to write this as a scenario, only to point out the possibilities that exist in this, that this is the way this type of thing would work, that it would be his self-exaltation as a god in part that might lead to problems with the king of the south. And whatever it is, the king of the south pushes at him, and that catches us back up with this fellow at the time of the end. Same guy. But again, let me caution you, don't start writing names in here. And don't start creating scenarios around them, because they are likely to be wrong. Now, I want to back up a little further in chapter 11 to see what else we can learn about this fellow. And mind you, this is seamless as pertains to time. In chapter 11, verse 20, then shall stand up in his estate. Now, the his is a preceding king of the north. Now, the king of the north is a dynasty with successive individuals in it. And the individual we've been dealing with up until this time is one person who seems to be the one who exists at the end time, who culminates in the power, perhaps the beast power as we find him at the end time. Okay? One shall stand up in his estate, that is a former king of the north, a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger, nor in battle. It doesn't explain what happens to this raiser of taxes. There is, by the way, you'll find it in the commentaries, a historical type of this individual. Now we are starting to engage a sequence of people, each of which is a predecessor of the king of the north. And we'll go back to the antecedent of stand up in his estate in a bit. But in his estate, the raiser of taxes, when he's gone, shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. He will come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This is our man. This is the king of the north. This is his moving on the scene after the raiser of taxes. Shall he be a vile person to whom they will not give the honor of the kingdom? He'll come in peaceably, and he'll obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Historically, Antiochus Epiphanes. But that's not what Daniel is talking about. He's talking about an end-time character. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken. Yea, also the prince of the covenant shall be broken. Now, we can't tell for sure what that means. But if the man we're talking about is the king of the north, who is the last king of the north leading up to and culminating in the return of Christ, the breaking of the prince of the covenant is probably a reference to a high priest who might exist in Jerusalem, who might be one who is doing sacrifices at that time. Possibly. Presumably maybe a leader of the Jewish people. I don't know, could Ehud Barak today be called the prince of the covenant? Because the word prince, again, doesn't necessarily imply kingship. It means captain in one sense. And after the league made with him, he will work deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small people. Now this is a little interesting sideline. There's something we didn't know about him. He comes in not by power, he comes in by flattery, and he makes his move with a rather small people. And there's a really fascinating parallel to this man in history in Adolf Hitler, who actually was elected Chancellor of Germany by a free election, a free democratic election in that country. And he made his way into power with a strikingly small band of people, and finally was able to control the entirety of Nazi Germany. Perhaps another later type. He shall enter peaceably upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, spoil, and riches, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Now remember, this is early, right at the beginning of his work. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. The implication almost is the king of the south was down there minding his own business until this guy comes along. And this guy begins to cause problems that end up getting him in conflict with the king of the south. With a great army, the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a great and mighty army, but he will not stand. And this is a strange thing. They will forecast devices against him. And this is not explained. But then it says, yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat, that is the king of the south's food, shall destroy him. The implication is that insiders in the king of the south's own court, his own government, undermine him in this first conflict with the king of the north and cause him to lose, and many of his people fall down slain. This implies espionage and treason in the kingdom of the south. But who were the forerunners of these kings? At some time prior to Antiochus, there was a predecessor, another king of the north. Verse 13. Here we go. Further back. This king of the north shall return and set forth a multitude greater than the former, and certainly come after certain years with a great army and much riches. And in those times there shall stand up against and many shall stand up against the king of the south. Notice, not just him, but many shall stand up against the king of the south. Also, the robbers of your people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Sounds like a time almost of chaos and bandits and everything else. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that comes against him shall do according to his own will, and nobody can stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand will be consumed. This almost is like another invasion of the glorious land, which there's a later one that we come across later in this entire thing. This is an earlier king, and then later the king of the north comes and does it again. And one begins to wonder at this point, as you work your way back in the book of Daniel, if now Daniel is really beginning to move back into the history, that is, into the types that took place here. He shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. Now you can read the historical fulfillment of this again in any commentary, and every time I've heard people try to give me all the rundown, it's my eyes glaze over and I start drifting off on them. But if you want to study it, it's all there for you, and it's well understood by Bible students and scholars. After this, he'll turn his face to the isles and take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. He shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he'll stumble and fall and not be found. Wars, goings back and forth of all these kings, perhaps patterns to be repeated in our own time. We cannot tell. And now I'll take you back right to the beginning of chapter 11, so we can kind of close out on this with the awareness of the duality and the nature of the duality of it. The angel speaking to Daniel says, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. The fourth will be richer than they all, and by his strength through his riches he will stir everybody up against the realm of Grecia. This is the ancient kingdom of the Medes, which got stirred up and became very wealthy, but also incurred the attention and perhaps ire of one man named Alexander the Great, who was the king of the realm of Grecia. A mighty king shall stand up, Alexander, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. It is not at all clear that there is an end-time fulfillment of this passage through here. But what is really strange about it is you will read Daniel 11 and 12, and the thing as far as timeline is concerned seems to be completely seamless. And it's not easy to read through it and determine, is this early? Is this late? I mean, who did this? Who are these kings? When this he shall stand up, that's Alexander, his kingdom shall be broken, divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, not to his own children, his own posterity, nor according to his dominion. His kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside these. At the death of Alexander, his 4 generals divided his empire, and out of this the 2 dominant powers are what Daniel calls the king of the north and the king of the south. And their positions geographically were Syria and Egypt, historically. But as I told you before, that's the historical pattern. The end-time fulfillment will follow the pattern, but with important differences. And you need, so consequently, to go back and try to write a scenario for the future out of the past is a mistake. This part of the prophecy, though, seems to be purely historical, laying the groundwork for understanding what is going to come later. It says in verse 5, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be great. And in the initial part of it, the king of the south, that is that general of Alexander who had Egypt, was the strongest of the 4 by far. Then it says in verse 6, in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and deal against them and prevail. You can look at this again in the commentaries, and they will give you the historical model, all the fulfillment of these events. But isn't it fascinating that as you read it, and as you make your way all the way down to the 12th chapter of Daniel, you find that you're in the end time, and you don't have any idea exactly when you got there in the course of reading the prophecy. Now, I don't doubt that you find yourself somewhat confused by this front-to-back approach, by my making my way back through all these things. The reason I did it the way I did it was because I wanted to impress indelibly upon your mind that the prophecy is about the end time. It's not about Antiochus. It's not about these ancient kings and these descendants of Alexander the Great. If you start with 12, you work your way back, you can't escape it. It's all about the end time. The historical is only to give you a background for understanding what's going to take place at the time of the end. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to chapter 12 of Daniel again and consider where we are. At that time, chapter 12, verse 1, shall Michael stand up, that great prince which stands for the children of your people. And there will be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to the same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that is found written in the book. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. They that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Great promise. You know, those that turn people to righteousness, those who can actually be involved in turning people around, he's going to shine like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the word, seal the book to the time of the end. People are going to run to and fro, knowledge shall be increased. So I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood the other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, the other on the other bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen on the banks of the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen upon the waters of the river. He held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him that lives forever, It shall be for a time, and times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. You know, and if you could be really certain who the holy people were and what he meant by that, if you could just be really sure of what it meant to scatter the power of the holy people, it would give you a really interesting leg up on what's taking place here in the time. Daniel, I heard, but I didn't understand. I said, Oh Lord, my Lord, what's going to be the end of these things? He said, Go your way, Daniel. The words are closed and sealed to the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. The wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination of desolation set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Until what? Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,330 days. But go your way till the end be, for you shall rest and stand in your lot at the end of days. I don't know what those days are. I don't know where they start. I know where one of them starts, but I don't know what the end of it is. And I don't know what it means when it says, Blessed is he that comes to the 1,330 days. But now you know that they're here, and you have a picture of what's supposed to happen at the end time, and it would pay us all, I think, to pay very close attention to what's going on in the Middle East.